Hello, everyone, and welcome to another session of the Left Book Club's Anticapitalism series with Gargi Bhattacharyya. Tonight, we'll be discussing anti-capitalism and food with some incredible speakers all under one virtual roof. So we're really happy to have you all join us. My name's Elif, and I work with the Left Book Club on events and political education. A little bit about the Left Book Club. We are a subscription book club and not-for-profit initiative. We seek to foster a spirit of collective learning and political education. We aim to create spaces and avenues where people can learn from each other and discuss radical ideas that inform actions and practical steps, and also with the goal of supporting the struggles that are fighting for us all. Our events feature speakers such as Kate Mann, Grace Blakely, Kojo Koram, Lewis Gordon, our very own Gargi, Harsha Walia, Lolo Olufemi, Dali Gabriel, and our discussions engage with a wide range of radical thought. During the event, and as you guys who are on watching us on the YouTube live stream, don't forget to ask your questions. So you can just pop them in the chat and I'll be gathering them, and I'll try and make sure as many questions as possible are answered by our amazing speakers. If you would like to become a member of the Left Book Club, please visit leftbookclub.com and click Become a Member tab. Alternatively, you can start by subscribing our mailing list, which if you scroll to the bottom of our homepage, you'll see the box there. The links are also in the description of the YouTube live stream. Please don't forget to follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at Left Book Club to keep up to date with our events, promotions, and giveaways. We've got some really exciting ones coming up throughout the next month, so please keep with us for that. Also subscribe to our YouTube channel while you're watching us tonight. As we all know, as we've all been in internet land for the last year, if the connection does go a bit choppy, don't worry, we will be working to get it back up as soon as possible, but hopefully it will all be smooth, and it has been for most of our events. So this event was with the idea and principle and a thought that nobody should go hungry. And yet, as many of you who have probably joined us will know, food banks are everywhere. The politics of food, the approach to food is in some ways ever more marginalizing, but there's also been some incredible organizing that has been done around food distribution and access to food, particularly within the last year. So tonight we'll be discussing a revolution in how we can think about and organize about food. Our speakers are Gargi Bhattacharyya, who will also be setting the scene of the session today. Gargi is one of the UK's leading scholars on race and capitalism. She is the author of Rethinking Capitalism, Dangerous Brown Men, Traffic, and the co-author of Empire's Endgame that came out last year. We also have Shiri Salmi, who is a community and political organizer. She also co-founded Corporation Town in 2019. Corporation Town is a new network of community-led food co-ops self-organized by autonomous residents groups across the UK who source and distribute food to members at extremely affordable costs. Amardeep Singh Dhillon is a bartender and trade union organizer with South London Bartenders Network. He is an editor at Red Pepper, columnist with Stir to Action, and a freelance journalist specializing in the hostile environment, workers' rights, climate justice, and the new economy. Amardeep has been involved in food provision via co-founding mutual aid group None Head Knocks, trying to set up local food co-ops, and has written about food provision infrastructure and its role in civil disobedience. Melek Erdal is a cook, teacher, writer, and community activist. She studied history at UCL and has worked within diverse and grassroots community projects. In 2015, Melek made a documentary in Cuba, winning the Rain Dance Best Short Documentary Award, and has appeared on BBC Radio 4's The Kitchen Cabinet podcast. Melek believes in the use of food as a form of connection and preserving identity and history, strongly defending food as a resilient language. Her most recent projects have been with Cook for Syria, the Felix Project, Made in Hackney Community Kitchen, where she heavily focused on food sustainability and communal cooking as a form of bringing dignity back into communities that are pushed out with food snobbery. So, I mean, with that introduction, I'm sure we are all excited to hear what everyone has to say. So with that, over to you, Gargi.
Thanks so much, Elif. And again, thanks to everyone who's come today. And people who've come to our events before will know that we wanted to create a space that really thumbed our noses a bit at the British state. You know, the British state says at the end of 2020 is like, oh, the children are learning anti-capitalism, stop it, stop it. And we've tried to use that as an opportunity to really promote anti-capitalist thought to a much wider audience who might never have heard it before. And some of the topics we've chosen have really been about shaking up both the mainstream and I hope shaking up the left a bit. I really feel like getting to run an event on anti-capitalism and food is a bit of a win in itself, because certainly in my political history, that's not often how the meetings are billed. And I feel that even that is a step, a different kind of step for us. So I'm going to say a few things about what my interests have been and how we might think about debates around food alongside the kind of longer set of debates I've been thinking of in this series around anti-capitalism. Then I hope we're going to have I know we're going to have a very apt and up to the minute kind of very timely debate about food right now, which, as Elif has said, it's become such a core topic within both left organising, but actually in kind of charity organising as well. It's become that kind of crisis point for us right now. So about what do we do as people who want to imagine a life beyond capitalism, to think about that moment of crisis and what can we do with it. I always try and say a little bit about, what is the beast of capitalism that we're looking at? Because we always say, this is not a Marx reading group. There's plenty of great Marx reading groups if you want to do that. This doesn't say, quickly turn to volume 2 now, I'll be going through this chapter. It's not that kind of a party, but it is a party where we hope that you'll go away and think, oh, even though that was a really fun evening, I'm starting to think a bit differently about one moment of the crisis of capitalism, or something about how capitalism impacts on my life. So just so that we've said it for everyone in the room, of course, one of the ways that capitalism operates is by trying to bring all of life to the market. If my knickers are not there yet, they will be tomorrow. If my mother's best recipe is not there yet, it will be the day after tomorrow. So everything is kind of brought to marketization if it can be. Because the idea is that things only matter once they can become a source of profit to someone, no matter what the consequences are for human and non-human survival and well-being. Some of the things our three speakers are kind of so embedded in, like, even though bringing every aspect of food need to the market leaves much of the world hungry, capitalism can't leave it alone. And those kind of barriers to the means of life become absolutely normalized under capitalism. So that's one thing that I hope that we'll talk about a bit. As if, this idea that anything only matters if it can become profitable. All of this kind of non-debate about whether kids should have free school meals in the holiday is linked to that. The idea of, what do you mean people have a right to eat? The right of someone else to make profit out of their hunger always trumps our right to eat. Capitalism is partly how we normalize that kind of nutty logic that as if we do not have a right to the means to life because the market trumps it. So if someone else owns that means to life, what do you mean that you're hungry? You can't make that call. Now, in lots of ways, the pandemic has shaken that up, hasn't it? Although it's dreadful, I also kind of am heartened about the ways in which the Marcus Rashford campaigns it's been very difficult for people to disagree. The Tory party has been put on the wrong foot by saying, oh, how dare you? People are buying satellite TV, they could be feeding their children. They've misjudged the ways in which pandemic has made people think slightly differently about access to the means of life. And certainly there's been all kinds of on-the-ground mobilizing about the place of food and what we think we mean by food access. That if there's food access, that's the emergency food access of today, the food parcel, the soup kitchen today. And then there's a kind of slightly longer term question about, okay, if pandemic shows what a crisis point food access is, how can we start to think it in a slightly longer term? And of course, and I'm guessing that many of the people who've come are people who are involved in this. A lot of that has been through a resurrection or reinvigorating of ideas of mutual aid, things which existed on the anarchist left, but which were quite niche interests. Now it feels, can't go to a neighbourhood anywhere where there isn't a mutual aid arrangement of some kind. And that's also an interesting shift in how people are able to think. Because the idea of mutual aid, the idea that our survival is in each other, and even when Kropotkin puts forward the idea of mutual aid, it's from his naturalist side. He goes out and kind of watches wolves and badgers and birds and insects and says, look, how can you read Darwin to say that we have to kill each other to live? If you go and look at the natural world, actually we support each other to live. That's the argument of mutual aid. And Kropotkin is making quite a biologistic argument in favour of mutual aid. But it shifts our left thinking for us to think again, okay, well, maybe my survival is absolutely bound up with other living and non-living things. Maybe that's the only way me and my family are going to make it. I hope today we're also going to think about some of the other questions which certainly in my life haven't been talked about as much. And I'm interested in whether anyone knows some answers or ways of thinking about these things. I've already said that I hope we're going to talk a little bit about how we think about practices of mutuality beyond emergency support, not because emergency support isn't absolutely urgent, but because we hope we're going to build a world that goes beyond these moments of emergency. Does that mean we also, across those of us who wish to build a better world, need to learn skills around producing, transporting, storing food, not only distributing and building mutual aid? What would that mean? That blows my mind, that kind of thing. And also to think again, to say that, well, look, capitalism, of course, is failing abysmally at feeding the world and at safeguarding the planet. We all know that. But equally, under capitalism, we've seen the most and extensive and far-reaching and most diverse production of foodstuffs ever known to humankind. And that's also the food landscape that we're kind of all accustomed to. And this is a bit really, I feel a bit ashamed and embarrassed about this bit. If I don't ask you, who am I going to ask? I wondered if we might think a little bit about how we address our dependency on mass-produced foodstuffs, and should we even try? There have been different left kind of writings and theorizations of what post-capitalist food production might be. And I always think, where's the kind of fun, trashy food in that? Is there going to be all that horrible American food, that thing where that marshmallow spread? Are we going to have that in post-capitalism? Are we going to have, I don't know, very, very yellow American mustard in a jar? All the things which are not good for you. Is that going to be there? Equally, are we going to have things that we've got used to having a lot of only because of big agribusiness? Where are those kinds of foodstuffs going to go? Will we even be eating the same things when we imagine the transition to a better world? And then the other stuff, this is really like deep in my embarrassment psyche, but I feel like you're my family now. Will we have to recreate the opportunities for sociality that are now offered by commercial food services? Will really everything be healthy and good for us after capitalism? Or will we still have dirty street food that your mum tells you not to eat? Secret snacks, come from a family, my dad hides crisps in the wardrobe, don't tell anyone. And teenage dates in ice cream bars and burger joints, because food is also that landscape of how we see each other in the illicit and fun ways. And it's more than immediate need, isn't it? It filters all of our relationships. And I hope we might get to a little bit of that. And of course, as always, I hope all of you out there in your living rooms and bedrooms might type your ideas about those anti-capitalist food cultures, post-capitalist food cultures that we might be imagining. So with that, on to my experts who know much more about food than I do. And I'd like Melek to please come in first to speak, and I'll mute myself so I won't get in the way.
Hi, everyone. First of all, I want to just thank you guys for inviting me on here to talk. It's a real honor. I was really excited to come on today and talk because for me, what I think about when I think of what does it mean to talk about anti-capitalism and food in relation to food. For me, it's about reclaiming food and its value in our society, right? So it's about rejecting the idea of food as just a commodity, and going beyond the idea of it as a human right as well, as a thing of sustenance. Food, for me, is a currency, but a currency for life, a currency for dignity. It's about preserving and regenerating culture. And it's about reinforcing and establishing a sense of identity and pride in your heritage and your roots. So food is really a language for me. It's, you know, when I think of my like immigrant background, food was the first language we could really communicate in this when we migrated here in this country. You know, we my parents spoke Kurdish. They spoke Kurdish with themselves. They spoke Turkish with me, and I spoke English to the outside world. So it was you know, so really the one universal thing we could all communicate in was food. So food was a source of dignity for us. It was a thing we were confident in assimilating with the community with, right? Establishing ourselves, saying, hey, we are here and we want to be part of the community. And so it was a really empowering thing, right? So when I think about capitalism and food and how it just basically reduces food to a commodity, you know, I think it's taking away our sovereignty and our sense of selves. I was actually reading because I wanted to, you know, read up when preparing for today, and I read something really interesting. Someone said about, you know, we talk about the system being broken, right? The food system being broken, and someone wrote very well that the system is not broken. It's doing exactly what it's meant to be doing. It's the system is wrong in itself. But it's functioning exactly how it was intended to. So it's the idea of thinking of a different way, way of doing things and structuring. And it described the current food system like an hourglass, which I thought was really interesting. So an hourglass in the sense that you have the billions of farmers all over the world who produce the food, and then you have the billions of people who eat the food the farmers produce, and then you have the handful of corporations in the middle that control the land, the production, the distribution, the sales, the marketing, everything, right? And which blows my mind, but I think it's very evocative to think of it like that. And what these corporations are doing that have no interest in either is pitting consumers and producers against each other and creating this false narrative that seeking fair prices for food and seeking fair wages conflict, and that they can't operate together, which is false, right? And for me, what I'm preoccupied with day to day in cooking food, mainly what I do in communities, is how that kind of structure and that language trickles down into everyday communities, right? In our areas. Most recently being the school meal scandal, right? There's a 1,000 whispers in society that our young people hear that they're not important, that they grow up, that you're not relevant. There's 1,000 ways they hear that. And this was for me gut-wrenching, because it was just another way for them to have to hear that they don't matter. You know, there's this false idea of opportunity, that opportunity exists for everyone. That's an illusion. It's not true, because society isn't programmed that way. Even me, you know, when I supposedly had all the opportunities given to me, but you know, when I reached university, I realized that that wasn't the case. That I had a completely different education than people who had gone to private schools to get to the same place, and knew how to write an essay. Right? And I up to then I just thought you copy and pasted. I didn't know you had, like, I learned what plagiarism was at university. And everything, I had what's called imposter syndrome. I thought, oh gosh, they're going to catch me out. I'm not meant to be here. You know, everything in that environment said, I'm not meant to be there. And where, you know, and that trickles down into the rest of society. I mean, I ended up leaving university and doing what I know. I opened a cafe. and this is what I was confident in. Had I realized I had very valid things to say and I knew how to say them, it took time for me to create the language to identify what these things had done, these systems had done, and the way they had made me feel. So yeah, for me, it's really about sovereignty, right, in food, and how we reframe again the narrative and empower people again. And I think lockdown, the one positives that we were talking about, guys, together briefly, is it's kind of unveiled, it's kind of lifted the veil on the what we presumed was important in our society, and these kind of status roles, like, you know, what the government said, you know, the government in proposing, you know, these like point systems in how you're meant to come to this country, right? Like, and who is valuable, what kind of jobs are valuable in our society. I feel like lockdown really lifted the veil on this, and we realized that the important people in our society are our shopkeepers, are our delivery people, are the people who work in the hospitality industry. They're the ones, when we were all like couldn't find toilet paper, which side thought, I don't know why, was just so important, but when we couldn't find basic things like pasta and things like that, they're the ones that made us survive, right, helped us survive. And we realized what is truly important in our society, and how are we valuing these people, you know. And amazing initiatives started happening, right? So that was I've always, all my work with food has been with community, you know, and how food can work in community. But seeing what lockdown did was amazing, where I think, Gargi, what you were saying about, you know, capitalism somehow like making us, it does efficiently what it's meant to do and mass produce food, right? But actually what I saw lockdown there was so much voluntary work happening, and it really dispelled the idea that people have to work for money to work efficiently, or like, you know, or rally together and organize. When we want to, when we are empowered to do so, we rally together really efficiently for no money, but for purpose instead. And I think the key lies in local activism, right? Because when it's very difficult, it's all very surreal and abstract when you're trying to think globally. But when you think of your neighbor and how to help your neighbor, and you're more accountable, you then start caring about where you're getting your food, how you're helping your community, and all these things. And that's what I've seen, these local community-led food co-ops that I know Shiri is going to talk about, that I've been involved in as well. It's moving away from food banks, which actually kind of still feed, it's just survival, isn't it? It's not empowering. Whereas these now community food co-ops are about using basically local residents helping other local residents. Okay, and I think that's incredibly empowering, and I think this is an exciting opportunity right now, where there could be a shift and a reframing in how we see ourselves in relation to the communities we live in, and how food can not only reinforce this, but bring back dignity in our sense of selves. I hope that made sense.
No, thank you so much, Melek. That was great. And just, you know, and so many things that you're saying that are really what we want to talk about today. So I'd like to bring Shiri in next, please. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Hi. Yeah, thanks. This was really interesting, Melek, and also Gargi. I'm going to actually talk about an organization that I helped set up, which is called Corporation Town. And like Elif said, it's a new network of community food co-ops. And maybe before I introduce kind of what it does and how it came about, it maybe is useful to just be really clear about what is a food co-op and what is not a food co-op. So co-ops are structures that obviously existed for about 150 years in this country. They started as the idea of this kind of format with groups of people who said, you know, we all need to go to the shop every day. Why don't we own the shop? Why are we making somebody else rich through the process of, you know, getting the stuff that we need? And that kind of structure has been then translated into other forms of organizing around housing, around, you know, consuming goods, workers' co-ops, and so on. The community food co-op is a similar structure. What it is not a food bank, in the sense that there is no charity relationship between the people that give food and the people who receive food. It is also interestingly not a mutual aid group, and this is something that Melek touched on. Because the mutual aid groups that we have seen coming up, you know, over the last year, which are wonderful and great, and it was a beautiful thing, effectively still reproduce this model of some people have, you know, the capacity or the resources to share food or their time, and other people receive it. And I think it's actually quite interesting to think that, you know, the people who were doing it, of course they were doing it, and we all did, out of the, you know, goodness of our heart and our excellent politics, but also because lots of people were able to, they were furloughed, maybe they weren't paying rent, they had the time and the confidence to organize in their communities. And these people have gone back to work, because I don't know about your mutual aid group, but looking around where I live, they've kind of died out. I hope they don't, you know, disappear altogether. So a food co-op is not that. And more specifically, Corporation Town, as an organization or as a network or as an idea, started before, not long, but a little bit before COVID, in sometimes in 2019. That's when it actually came into being. Before that, before it was in the world, it was in my head for about a year. And the idea for Corporation Town didn't come from my, you know, deep interest in food or my love of, I don't know, cooking and packing food. It actually came about on the streets. Some of you may remember, maybe some of you in this call today were there. In 2018, we were fighting the fascists yet again on the streets. We were literally being crushed by police. It was pretty hairy. And as the police were sort of pushing us and we were pushing back, I was thinking, God, there must be a better way. I mean, we can't be fighting fascism on the street forever, and we can't be kind of fighting our way towards that world that we imagine. There is this kind of anti-capitalist future that, you know, can kind of go a little bit more into detail maybe later, but fighting is important, but maybe there is another way. Maybe we can build. And literally there with the police horses and everything, I was like, God, what can we build that's really relevant to all of us, that we can come around and that would make sense to everyone who's not read Marx, everyone who's not been to uni, you know, what is it that we all feel deeply and you know, widely in the kind of language of trade unions, and that is obviously food. And kind of it was a very you know, sort of a spark of an idea. It wasn't very well formulated, but it took about a year of percolating to kind of turn into an event where we suddenly were able to offer lots of food. And like I think both of you before me said, you know, when we're so used to be consuming and to kind of, you know, to pay for everything and to see everything as a commodity, when we did those events, those first events around food in, you know, on the local estate in our neighborhood, you could literally see people walking around and saying, it looks like a shop. There's a lot of food here, but where's the till? Like, where's the no money? And this is where we could start those conversations, that actually there is a parallel, kind of a parallel universe of surplus food that is just in circulation. It's kind of somewhere between waste and charity. And you know, and maybe we can capture it. And there are all these spaces which belong to us, you know, the community centers, even the churches, even the, I don't know, the libraries, they belong to us. These are, you know, if we brought these two together, maybe there is something around that. So like I said, we started with a series with a kind of small events, and planted the idea of the community food co-op, which actually brings everything that I said together. So the model is simple. Groups of neighbors come together, 20 households, for a reason that, you know, to make it more democratic, to make sure that everyone is heard, to make sure everyone's got a job in the co-op, because in the co-op, nobody is a consumer or a philanthropist. Everyone is a member, which means that we all take care of each other. We don't work for somebody else, and they don't work for us. And the food that the Corporation Town food co-ops kind of bring together is a combination of that surplus food that you can only access if you work with your friends or with your neighbors or with your comrades. It's not available to us as individuals, as it shouldn't be. And food that is bought in bulk, which is the kind of bread and butter of co-ops. You know, as a group of people, we've got access to, you know, if we pool our resources, we have more money. With 100 quid, you can buy cheaper food than you can with £5 going down to the shop. So that combination of sources of food is the sort of the material that the Corporation Town Co-ops organize around. The way we organize is nothing new. We listen to each other, we have meetings, we make decisions together, we pool our resources. We get everything into ideally one place that we can organize in. It's an organizing place. It's not a food bank. And we share everything in the co-op. I thought this was just, you know, let's try and run one out, you know, on the estate here, see if it works. Turns out it was a great idea. Loads of people thought it was useful. To be fair, an article in a kind of relatively famous lefty magazine publication helped. And within a month, probably, we had people up and down the country calling us to say, you know, can we start one on our estate, on our street, with my neighbors, you know, who might want different food from the people on your estate. And that's the idea, because the co-ops run by the members, they decide what to have, and you know, and how to organize. So we set up an organization, as in, we have a bank account, we are registered with whatever company's house. We produced, I'm going to show you, we produced this, which is a guide, a kind of toolkit, how to start a co-op. Why should you start a co-op? Is it relevant to your community? Maybe it's not. What to do when people don't agree with each other? Where do I get the food from? All those kind of things. We've got a website, we've got all the kind of means of communication that would help to you know, spread the word and support other people. We raised funding so that we have paid organizers, which can support loads of groups. At the moment, we're working with about 26, maybe 28 groups up and down the country. They come from groups of people who just, you know, me and my neighbors, we want to buy food together. What do I do now? And we support them to do this. Sometimes it's through bigger networks, maybe local community centers. Maybe, I think we're speaking now to a network of churches in South London. We're speaking to, you know, various other groups, whole local authorities, for example, in Preston, got in touch and asked us, like, can you try and roll this out across the city? Obviously, all this brings new challenges. Organising with council officers watching is different from organising, you know, on your estate with a bunch of neighbours. These are all things that we kind of need to adapt and to kind of, you know, find our ways around it, and that's fine, because we don't know all the answers, and we don't expect ourselves to know all the answers. Our members do. I've never been to, I don't know, I've never been to Hull, but we've got a corporation town co-op there that's been running for over a year, and they are the experts on how to run a co-op there. Just responding really quickly, if I still have time, to a few things that people said. The idea of a post-capitalist kind of future and horizon, I mean, the co-op structure, as I understand it, and as we kind of use it, is not revolutionary. It doesn't necessarily call for, you know, dismantling the state, even though personally, I mean, I'd dismantle it tomorrow, yesterday. But it is about this idea of dual power, which again, you know, an idea that we didn't come up with. How can we build this new world that we want to imagine with the principles and the politics and the way that we relate to each other and the way that we work together, in, you know, in the shell of the old, in this current world that is absolutely terrible and horrific and exploitative and everything that everyone else said. And, you know, Gargi, you mentioned Kropotkin. Of course, this is an idea that is rooted in anarchism. Not something that we maybe talk about with everyone that we speak to. Maybe the Left Book Club is the right place to mention it. But also, we don't do political education in the sense that maybe other groups do. We don't wait for people to be like ready politically, or, you know, for the class consciousness to arrive to the level where they would organize themselves. We want to organize through action, because we know, like that first group that I mentioned at the beginning, through the action of being in the space and around other people, around the food, you kind of start thinking, hold on, but there's no money involved. You know, I don't need to buy anything. Or you know, my relationship with the people around me is based on need, not on transaction. And the one last thing that I want to say is about, yeah, is there going to be fun, guilty food, dirty food after the revolution? 100%. You know, when we started, people were like, oh, so is it going to be like an organic co-op where, you know, it's all going to be really good and, you know, worthy? And we said, well, we don't know. Like, if your co-op only wants to buy frozen chips, that's cool. It's your co-op. I'm not going to tell you what to eat. I don't want to be in a revolution when I tell you what to eat. So yeah, that's us.
Thanks so much, Shiri. I know everyone always says whenever people talk about Co-op Town, like just how inspirational it is, but thanks, you know, it's a much bigger audience, well, different audience probably comes to this. So I hope some people out there in their living rooms and bedrooms will think, oh yeah, I could do that. Me and my street could do that. And we want frozen chips. I don't want to eat kind of organic lentils, and it's all possible, because I think that sense that everything's possible is really part of what, you know, we want people to try and talk about here. So last but not least, kind of headliner, I'd like to bring in Amardeep. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Gargi. Yeah, the prerequisite of me coming on this discussion was that I would be the headliner, so I appreciate that. Yeah, and I think that was a really good last point, Shiri. I'm not here for a revolution that does not include Morley's, frankly, so like that's good news to me as well. So I found what Gargi was saying really interesting about food culture. So I'm someone who only cooks communally, really, like for or with other people. I've experienced disordered eating, and I've dealt with that through cooking and eating as a communal practice, right? And following on from what Melek was saying, food is a way of constituting identity as well, because identity is rooted in relationships with people around us, right? So whether that's sharing my mom's recipes for tandoori wraps or taking the piss out of my white friends who, bless them, cannot handle spice. It's also about, you know, remembering my weekends as a teenager washing dishes at the Gurdwara, the Sikh temple, which is seen as a form of service and even a form of worship. Conversely, though, as someone from a Jat caste, so my family are Punjabi, they're from India, where the caste system is still very prevalent, right? And so my relationship with food, to an extent, is related to that, because we come from a peasant landowning farming caste, and it's taken a long time to unpick received associations of Jat supremacist Punjabi identity with tilling the land, right? With like farming being in my blood. And those conversations are embedded in casteist narratives that involve the dispossession and disempowering of lower caste Dalit laborers who don't own land, right? So like from the start, thinking about food organizing for me is also thinking about land ownership as well. And it's interesting because I'm third generation. I did English, at uni. I couldn't be further from the farming lifestyle of my grandparents in the villages of Punjab, and yet those power relations still persist. And I think it's important to bear that in mind, especially when we're talking about food organizing within diaspora communities and within non-white communities. So I've been involved in food provision, I guess, primarily recently through mutual aid. So over the pandemic, I helped co-found a mutual aid group called None Head Knocks. We supplied, I think, over 1,000 hot meals, hundreds of food parcels, and tried to tackle food insecurity primarily in South London. I've also been involved in conversations with Sikh socialists around the practice of langar. So langar is a Sikh practice that you can loosely translate as communal food provision, right? If you go to any Sikh gurdwara, there'll be a langar hall where there's free communal food available, right? And it's often seen in very reductive senses, as like you go to the temple, you get a free meal. And a lot of Sikhs at the moment are thinking about, well, what is the radical potential actually about communal food provision? That's complicated by, the Sikh identity as a model minority. A lot of us are very middle class now, we're very assimilated, and like middle class people cooking nice meals for other middle class people doesn't have a lot of radical potential. But that framework definitely provided me with like the building blocks of thinking about food provision outside of the normal transactional capitalist frameworks. And after my involvement with mutual aid, a lot of us in South London, were hugely inspired by Cooperation Town and by the work Shiri's been doing. So we're trying to set up some food co-ops in South London as well. I know we dropped the ball on that, Shiri. We will be in contact, I promise. But more recently, I've been thinking about food organizing primarily from an internationalist perspective, inspired by the farmers' protests in India that have been happening over the past 9 months. So the Kisan Andolan, which is a farmers' movement protest in India, are resisting the neoliberalization and privatization of Indian agriculture, right? And thinking about what that means as someone in the global north has been really interesting, because if you think about how the farmers in India have and laborers in India have been met with, tear gas, rubber bullets, barbed wire, kettling, the detainment of journalists, state violence, with agriculture as a central terrain of struggle. On the face of it, especially in mainstream media, that kind of like food organizing and that kind of struggle is positioned as fundamentally removed from anything we could face in the UK. But based on my background, as an organizer, with trade unions in terms of migrant solidarity and like radical queer activism, I've been thinking about, what does it mean for food organizing to actually enable radical organizing in the global north. And I'm thinking specifically here about, the transition towards the US-style prison industrial complex, the development of what are going to become, concentration camps for migrants in particular, the criminalization of dissent. The British left lacks any comparable infrastructure to langar, which has sustained the farmers' protests in India for 9 months. Those protests and occupations of the highways have continued because food provision, communal food provision, is baked into the culture and the philosophy there in a way that's just not in the UK. And the British left does lack a comparable infrastructure to facilitate mass resistance to state oppression for more than maybe a few days of action. So I guess generally speaking, like the initiatives that you'll find aimed at food provision in the UK are localized, disparate. There's food banks, food halls, community fridges, membership, supermarkets, and those are supplemented by food provision by religious and diaspora community centres. You've got some rural, worker co-op farms as well. But, I think the radicality of those spaces is, I'd say it's not something that you can state that's like, a vibrant, radical food organising culture in the UK, despite the fact that some are informally aligned with political causes. There are initiatives trying to combat that. So you've got the National Food Service, which is trying to, network those community initiatives to tackle food insecurity and food waste, to act as a framework around which publicly funded infrastructure could someday be built. And the Right to Food campaign, which Labour Party members have been championing, has been a really key part of that, trying to enshrine food access as a legal right. And they do vital life-saving work in lots of cases. But the utility of that in sustaining civil disobedience is limited, in the same way that mutual aid food provision is limited, because a charity model provision can't be switched to provide support for explicitly politicized causes. That pre-Zoom beer was a bad idea. Because that organising isn't actually embedded in the wider radical tradition of activism in which we're trying to insert it. You can't have food organising that provides food parachuted into sustain occupations or camping outside fossil fuel offices or detention centres. You can't parachute in food provision that's done by food co-ops, for example, because that is still service provision. It's just service provision within less spaces. The Langar of the Kisan Andolan was effective because it was embedded within the effective community. So it has to be part and parcel of the organising environment of the active left. And an interesting way to think about that as well, that often gets overlooked, is in terms of the workplaces that sustain food provision. So Angry Workers, for example, have done really, really interesting work trying to organise the food packaging warehouses in Greenford, I think, in West London, trying to build worker power at key sites that control food distribution within the capitalist system. And it's really important, I think, to remember that food distribution within the current system is contingent on the hostile environment and the exploitation of a primarily migrant workforce, whether it's Bulgarian migrants who over the pandemic were flown over to work in the fields, or whether you're talking about those with contingent migration statuses who are working in the factories packaging the food that makes it to the supermarkets. And I think radical spaces in the UK have lacked attention to food and care provision more broadly due to the devaluing of feminized labor, right? Like Shiri was saying, there's a bit of an appetite for kind of showing up to resist the fash, to kind of do demos, ad hacks, protests, occupations. That's a politics of spectacle. It's really, really important. But it's a lot less sexy, it seems, than actually building infrastructure that lasts. And I do think that's to do with the fact that childcare, social reproduction, food provision is seen as feminized labor, right? COVID has gone some way towards breaking that blind spot. Just the scale of needs soared so much, food insecurity became so evident that mutual aid networks had to respond to that. And I'm hopeful that we can capitalize that on the left to actually look critically at why it is that food organizing and food provision hasn't really been integrated at all into the other spaces in which we're organizing, against the state or outside of the state. And I think the real power of mutual aid, despite its limitations, and despite the fact that most of it hasn't actually been mutual aid, it's been charity, is the fact that, community serving work first involves community building. There's not one local community that you can serve. You actually have to construct that community through the process of actually that provision, right? And the key challenge for mutual aid groups is to shift from charitable provision to solidarity building. And it's in that context that food co-ops that Shiri's setting up are really, really powerful. And also the potential of those hyper-local spaces to actually politicize people who are involved. Like Gargi was saying, this isn't a Marxist reading group, you don't have to be really well-versed in theory. And like Shiri was saying, material provision can be the basis of further politicization. And, you know, in that context of constructing community, I think food organizing is really, really important. And I'm really hopeful, well, I'm always hopeful, that the left can actually learn from mutual aid and from food co-ops and realize that, you know, food provision has to be part and parcel of fighting the dystopian measures on the horizon from the state. Yeah, I think I'll probably end it there. But
no, thank you so much. That was great. So, I mean, you know, you've all three of you in different ways have kind of touched on some of the things that I was hoping we'd talk about next. I wondered if we might pick up where Amardeep left off, about both to say a little bit more about why food politics has for time did fall off the agenda of anti-capitalists, and I think that moment has passed, but also whether people have got any more thoughts about whether there is a need for us to build a bigger, more kind of textured infrastructure of food distribution. As Amardeep says, that in some parts of the world, tends to be the poorer parts, a community food ecology is partly how you survive when the state neglects you, and also how you survive when the state attacks you. Now, that's not quite really where we are yet in Britain. We've got plenty of attacking, but we don't have much, many kind of structures of sustenance. If people have got any ideas about the kinds of things that we might build on, or even if that's a kind of is that a next step? Is that a good idea? I don't know which order do you want to go in. We normally mix up the order. Do you want to go first, Shiri? Is that all right? Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, and thanks, Amardeep. And yeah, obviously looking forward to working with the South East London network of co-ops. I know it's coming. Yeah, about the question of like why has this kind of area, you know, like realm of organizing not been kind of on the surface or you know, as important as other things. I think Amardeep touched on it, and I think it's pretty fair to say that it's because it is considered women's place. You know, it's like it's the mundane, it's the obvious, it's obviously the natural. It happens, so it must be natural, and women just do it. So, you know, how can it be political? If we assume it's political, we assume everything. You know, we got to some territories that, you know, a lot of men don't want to go. But also, I think it's important to think about when food does come into the conversation as a political issue, it's always through another angle. Through labor rights, which, you know, quite a few of you mentioned, through animals' rights, maybe, you know, through like GM crops, through hunger in like conflict zones. So it's always through another prism that is always, you know, more relevant during politics. Of course, production of food is important, and we have to have this conversation, but that's not where, you know, the kind of the journey of food ends. I mean, for sure, land ownership, workers' rights, pay, all that is just one half of the journey of food. And when it leaves that and enters into the shop, the supermarket, the kitchen, our children, it's not interested, it's women's work. So there's all that. Same applies to childcare and sex work and other forms of kind of feminized labor. And then also, you know, when does it become like a public concern, an issue of public concern? It's when there's a crisis. So, you know, it could be hunger somewhere. It could be that, you know, there's Brexit and, you know, everyone is super worried about where their cheese is going to come from or something like this, or where there is the mad cow disease, the horse meat scandal. Does anyone remember that? I mean, whatever that was. Suddenly everyone is super interested in, you know, the minute detail of exactly what's on their plate, because then it's a scandal. So and then it's over, and everyone forgets about it. So that's the kind of, it's just interesting to see, like, you know, when do we start thinking about food? But then what you said, Gargi, about, you know, how come we don't do it? And maybe how come in poorer parts of the world there is organizing around food, around the entire chain, you know, people who know the farmers, maybe they are the farmers, you know, who can see, maybe the whole process, the production is visible to them. But also in this country, and you know, I'm a migrant too. I didn't grow up here when all this was a thing, but I heard that, you know, working class people in this country always cared, you know, for each other around food. This is not a new thing. You know, we always in our communities, even though I didn't grow up here, you know, this kind of care and sharing of resources has always been a thing, because this is what people have to do when there are not enough resources. And it's only you know, the last couple of generations that we assume that if each one of us is going to go to the shop, maybe we own the shop, like, you know, Thatcher wanted us all to have, and you know, and we just care for ourselves and our children.
I don't know if who would like to go next. Amardeep, do you want to come back in and then have Melek?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think Shiri got basically everything I wanted to say, to be honest. So thanks for that, Shiri. But yeah, I think also it's important to remember though as well that in terms of like the food provision organizing that's happened recently, that's, you know, maybe helped spark this conversation during the pandemic around mutual aid. You know, a lot of that was also, you know, middle class people who like then couldn't necessarily access food in the same way. And I do think that, you know, as much as like, it's important to be cognizant of that and of the limitations of that, but also it's a useful kind of test run in a way, because precarity is encroaching towards the middle classes, right? Precarity is not something that is circumscribed to like low skilled, low wage jobs anymore. It's you know, encroaching on even the more respectable sectors, and that precarity, even in terms of like food access and food insecurity, is expanding as well. And I think, you know, because maybe that hasn't been as apparent, like, you know, middle class people like myself have been really insulated from the need to do that. There hasn't been a need, right? And the community spaces in which often you'd actually like be able to socialize with people, and in which like food provision and food access would be kind of part of like that that space and would be materially important, has diminished, because like food access is just a matter of like, you know, disposable income and transaction. In terms of why the left has neglected it, yeah, again, like I think, you know, the devaluation of like feminized labor, like Shuri was saying. I also think as well that I also think this seems a bit rude, and I'm sorry to anyone who's insulted, but like a lot of the most radical aspects of the British left often are just not interested in infrastructure building, and like are just not used to it, maybe. Like, you know, there's such a sense of alienation as well, I think, because the radical spheres of organizing in the UK are so fragmented. There's not a continuity, you know, like the elders that we're going to learn from in terms of infrastructure, in terms of how to do things, in terms of communities, like it feels like every few years they kind of get reconstructed with like very little actual like pedagogy or very little learning from people that came before. Every time we do something, it feels inherently radical because we've got no historical context in which this has actually happened before. And I think, you know, in that sense, you know, political education is really important, because when you realize that what you're doing isn't something new and completely exciting, what you're doing is actually what people have been doing before you. And like, it's this atomization that has, you know, and like this aligning of certain classes with capital that has destroyed that. I think then we start to think about food organizing, hopefully, as like actually rebuilding from the ground up senses of solidarity. But it takes time, and you know, it's Shiri can tell you, I'm sure, like it's spreadsheets, it's meetings, it's minutes. It's not black bloc bash the fash, as much as that is also really important, right? I want black bloc to bash the fash, but I want them to do it with like, you know, a healthy, nutritious, free meal, supporting food co-ops in the global south. Why can't we have both, you know?
No, that's great. Melek, do you want to come in for a minute?
I mean, you guys, you've covered everything so well. I would just, going off of what both of you are saying, I think that it's just coming bringing awareness that it exists in communities. It's existed. It isn't something new. It isn't revolutionary. It is actually instinctive in us. You know, this idea of working together and organizing and being, you know, and doing things communally. We've been doing it. Migrant communities have been doing it because it's been about it has been so much about survival, but it's also spiritual and a cultural thing for us to do these things. It's just we haven't had the language to identify that was what we were doing, you know, or we haven't needed to you know, be aware of it. And I think the narrative has been hijacked by this kind of performative activism. It's been hijacked by a community of people that say that there's a superficial idea of, like, you know, we must take action, and it's reactive, right? And I think it's about reclaiming something that's already existed in our communities, but being able to one, identify that we've had this, and that it's a beautiful aspect of our communities, and be able to share it with the, like, not to have them isolated, but to be able to find ways to share it. And I completely agree with what you were saying, Amardeep, about how we're food organizing. I think both of you, Shira, you were also talking about, you know, currently it's being used reactively, right? When there's been an issue with food, but it's about actually investing in making this like culturally, you know, a thing, right? To bring communities together, to organize, and then see where we can use those things, right? To have the community organizing first, right? To have for it to happen that way, basically. That's my thing.
Thank you so much for that. I'm going to come back in a bit of a sniffy way as the chair, but I think absolutely Britain, as you know, all working communities all across the world, probably all through history, have shared, partly as a mode of survival, as people have said. What I thought more that Amardeep was pointing to, and this because I do agree with it, that if places such as Britain and some other places in the global north ever had a grassroots machinery and set of techniques for mass feeding, it's been lost. Some of that is it's actually it's a different set of skills. You know, some of you cook for a living. I don't cook for a living. Cooking for 50, 100, 200, 300 people, that's a different ball game for cooking for me and my neighbor. And temples and gurdwaras and other places, they do that. And there's a kind of, you know, the set of skills around doing that. There's also the kind of mechanism and machinery of how you feed a lot of people constantly. And partly, and you know, Ahmed says it much better than I did, that something that we've clearly been learnt from the farmers' protests in India at the moment, that is, if you want to have a week's, months-long face-off with the state who is trying to crush your community, you need people who can make sure people can, you know, can build a temporary toilet, and that everyone will eat and will get clean water to the place. And that feels like a different, you know, that's a different way of thinking about what the infrastructure of dissent and resistance is. And that there's something kind of in, when we say, you know, I really identified with it so much when Sherry talked about thinking, well, we must build something, but then there's also then what are the things that we must build. So I wondered if there's a bit more that anyone might want to say about, okay, we're building, you know, rebuilding, retrieving some pre-existing practices of solidarity, of helping each other, of not thinking in an individualistic way. Are there any other further steps that we might dream of for the anti-capitalist left in terms of what building a slightly bigger fighting infrastructure might be feeding sometimes, might be fighting sometimes, might be for us? Like, what I'm very interested in whether we need to learn food production. Do we need to learn food transportation? I certainly don't know. You know, what would be the things that we as a a bigger group, we might want to learn and build into our what we think organising is. Far too many of us know how to give a speech. I'm also one of those people. I think there's a limited view after capitalism of how many speeches will be needed, but some other things that might be. Did you see what I'm asking? Like, what kinds of, how might we imagine that next step? I almost gone off my screen. I don't know what's gone on here. Don't know. Do you want to try that first, Ahmad? Is that all right?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's interesting. So I recently wrote a column for Stir to Action about food provision, you know, in the UK and what infrastructure we might build, because I had similar thoughts. So I was like, well, maybe actually what we need is like a national framework where we can build that infrastructure that people can use. And actually, Shiri was one of the people I interviewed for it, actually. And what everyone said, and including organisers who have been involved in Occupy, organisers who bombs in Glasgow, all of them actually said the same thing to me, which is that we don't want a national infrastructure. What we want is for this to help build up, hyper-local communities, because the same people that are going to be organising, around food and food insecurity and provision are the same people that are going to be organising to try and shut down the local detention centre, or like say the local like GP centre or whatever, right? And so I think there's a tendency always to kind of think big picture, a little bit like what the what's it called? The Right to Food initiative is trying to do, right? And I think it's valid and it has use. But there aren't shortcuts. You can't just come up with like a national structure for this to work. Like you actually have to do the spreadsheets yourself first in your local community, and from that material solidarity, you will like literally be feeding that infrastructure that will then grow. I think it's really interesting what you say as well, though, about food production and food transportation and all of that. I mean, for one thing that came into my head was, if you wanted to do that, the best people you could get are the aunties from the Gurdwara, the matriarchs who run the kitchens, who grew up on farms in India and now run them like military operations to feed hundreds of people. But on a more serious note, I think it is challenging to think about what it means to live in the global north and organize around food, when actually we're the beneficiaries of food exploitation in the global south. We can organize and create fair and equitable systems of communal food distribution in the UK, and that there's no reason why that can't happen and still be based on neo-colonial exploitation of cheap imports from the global south. And the thing is, like, even when you're thinking hyperlocal about that kind of stuff, the implications are always big picture. Like the Kisan Andolan protests, one of the companies that has been really pushing for these new laws to go through that privatize agriculture is Adani and Ambani, and one of them, I can't remember which one, has launched an app called GeoGrishi. They're trying to digitize food procurement from farm to fork. Facebook has a 10% stake in it. It uses WhatsApp Pay. It was the route that WhatsApp Pay got to get into India, access to the Indian market. So we think of this like a localized struggle of like labourers and farmers fighting against the Indian government. It's not that. It's within neo-colonial structures. So I think even though it's daunting enough to think about how can we feed 100 people in like my postcode, but if you then actually try and think about, okay, how can we try and do that in a way that's not still reliant on the exploitation of the global south, it's really hard to think of anything. And partly, I think that's just because it hasn't really got any attention. When we think about anti-imperialism, a lot of the time on the left, we think about getting the troops back, which just really terrifies me in so many ways. But it's infrastructural, this violence that we're complicit in is infrastructural. And it's only by organizing locally on a material level and having those conversations that you can then start to think, okay, what would it take to start actually challenging that system from the inside?
No, thanks so much. Melek, would you like to go next? Like, you understood the rhythm that we switch the order around.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, a couple of hundred people, that's neighbours get together in a Kurdish community, as Elif would tell you. But yeah, jokes aside, I would go, I mean, before we even talk about, how we would, create these kind of structures, I would say we would first have to look at how we communicate. and who what we think as our local community. Because I think with the dawn of instant forms of communication, the idea of what is local and who are our friends and who is our community has changed and become really abstract and surreal, right? And there's the illusion of community you create on social media, and because you can connect to people thousands of miles away, and for some reason that is, especially for the younger generation, that seems to be more interesting because there's mystery in it, I guess. I don't know, but so I think it's about really tackling it, bringing intrigue back into who are your neighbors, and bringing real life communication back. And food actually is a powerful way to do that. And that's what I do. It's like I want to tell stories. I want local communities to tell stories. How they use food to get together. And what their issues are, and want to help. And it's very, very difficult to visualize a global issue. It's so much easier to know what's affecting your neighbor directly and then care about what's going on globally. And Amardeep is right. Then you hyper local issues then have a global impact, right? Yeah, that's it.
Oh, thanks so much. So Shuri, would you like to come in?
Yes, thanks. Yeah, that tension between the local, the hyperlocal, and is something that we think about quite a lot. In the context of organizing Corporation Town, which we kind of very early on decided to call a network. So this idea of an infrastructure is built into it. Like I said before, the form, the sort of the shape of what it looks like, that community organizing is actually based on hyperlocality. It is knowing your neighbors, and you know where they live and what their kids like to eat, and whose birthday it is, and so on. And sort of the idea is that once we organize with our neighbors around food, around something that we all just have to do, we all have to eat, then we find other things that we have in common, because our kids go to the same school, and maybe there's a bullying teacher there, maybe the GP closed, or the library, or the sports center, or whatever. And I just want to share something that happened just recently. One of our members just told me last week that she's organized a food co-op on her street. It's just one street. And there's enough families to create that kind of economy of scales that they can get food together and so on. And they're organizing around the Corporation Town principles and so on. And they're having a problem with their landlord. And she said, I know now that these people that I never knew before, they're not political, they're not activists, they've never been on a demo. We didn't even know that we had anything in common until like a month ago. They will stand outside my house and resist my eviction when the bailiffs come. And this is literally why we set up Corporation Town, because we know that those struggles are linked. And because we know that once we organize around one thing, once we learned how to organize with our neighbors, we can organize the shit out of it. We can organize other things, we can scale up. And again, and this is where the network comes in, because how can somebody in Birmingham or in Manchester or in somewhere else in London learn from that experience? How do we make sure that we can translate that and transfer it across our movement? How do we build a movement? So one thing is really practical. We suggest that Corporation Town co-ops don't grow too big, and when they get to 20 households, they do what every group and organization on the left is like the stuff of their nightmare, but they split. And that is the best thing that can happen to a co-op, because it means that 5 people who go and start a new group down the road, they're already organizers. They don't need to come to me or my comrades and my colleagues in Corporation Town headquarters to advise them on how to set up a co-op. They already know, they've already organized in their community. They are organizers. And maybe a month ago, they didn't think of themselves as organizers. And they're going to find 50 new neighbors, and that kind of structure would continue and self-replicate and grow. And which means that we kind of, again, built into the model, not just food distribution, not just learning to organize, but a form of movement building, hopefully. And again, and that can be replicated around other things, housing campaigns, I don't know, childcare networks, self-care, something else, I don't know. And linking them. We've just recently, when was it, last week, maybe this week, we suggested we came to the Kill the Bill public meetings, or maybe they weren't public, and said, Corporation Town will feed the actions, because we can. We've got enough food because we created an infrastructure. And we're now looking at, first of all, doing this with other groups. We're thinking about how can Corporation Town, through our members, through their interest, get involved in other campaigns. So a lot of our members in our space that we run in North London are asylum seekers. They have issues that they care about deeply, like not being deported, and they kind of, that's what they have in common. They organize around food. But that learning to organize means that they're now organizing in their hostels, and they're looking to organize to support other migrants and asylum seekers who are, like somebody said before me, are in effectively concentration camps at the moment in Kent. So, building this, and we're looking to scale up our network or sort of our infrastructure, because what if we get 3 tons of potatoes every week and distribute it around, through our network, so that not every co-op has to think about the logistics of doing it. They would have to think about the logistics of doing other things, because they would still need to be active organizers. But what if we, again, kind of clubbed together, pulled that resources, brought it a level up, and, we're looking to get a warehouse in North London. And we are getting, somebody says potatoes in practice, tomorrow morning, 400 kilos of potatoes arriving at our space in Kentish Town. Anyone needs some? Come over.
I mean, thank you so much, Melek, Shiri, Amardeep, of course, Gargi. I mean, I feel like this talk has really achieved what we set it out for it to achieve, and that's a discussion about food beyond necessity and beyond crisis. And I think that has been very, very crucial and very needed. And I think hopefully this is the start of many conversations. I mean, I really love all that, has been brought in, in just over an hour, from, the need for a feminist politics of food, to, of course, communal cooking. But also, I think one of the things that, again, this series is about doing what the left doesn't often do in terms of discussions. And one of the things that lacks as well, and I think there is some way that there has been some shift from that, but we've spoken about this at other sessions of this series, is discussions about spirituality, discussions about connections to the universe in general, and religion and belief and so on, and what that means for a future of revolutionary politics, left politics, and so on. So I really love Melek and Amardeep, but also Shiri and Gargi touched on to these ways of cooking of, I guess, what we can call non-capitalist societies. So not necessarily anti-capitalist societies, but societies where capitalism wasn't able to take root. And I think that's a really crucial place to look, actually, for some of these things, because these societies and these communities do exist in some parts of the world. I mean, unfortunately, not really, in very close proximity to where we are. So yeah, I think that also comes into talking about food not being a necessity, but also a very crucial fabric of society as well in how we relate to each other. So thank you very much. Oh, and actually one of the things is, I think, I love what you said, Shiri, towards the end of, like, we went to the coalition and we said we can feed the actions. So, feeding the revolution, I think that's amazing. And our viewers on the YouTube live stream wouldn't have seen this, but when Shiri was saying that, and also the potatoes, Amardeep said potatoes as praxis, and I think we really all certainly agree with that. What I like to do before I go to questions is read out some of the comments that I think stand out from the YouTube live stream. And so a few of them, someone said towards the beginning, and I think it was Melek when you were speaking, that young people are hearing each day 1,000 whispers that say you are not important, is such a powerful way to encapsulate what happened around the pitfall of free school meals that were given out. And I think I really wanted to kind of bring that to everyone, to also remind ourselves just how, insane that obviously was a thing. Also, someone said, and I think this is, again, in some ways a little bit of a response to what you were saying, Amardeep, is let's remember and revive the communal food supply during the 1984-85 miners' strike. The Barnsley miners' wives had a banner that said they did not starve. And someone also said Rochdale Equitable Pioneers cooperative food was at the very origin of a labor movement in 19th century Britain. And I think these are really crucial. I wanted to read these out because I think it's really crucial to also, again, everyone actually touched onto this. I don't think anyone was saying otherwise, that we don't need to recreate the wheel. We do have this in our history. There is a legacy of this, but of course it, unfortunately became lost for a while. Someone also said, and again, this is to you, Amardeep, watching this while cooking and now eating dal and rice with my mum. Thank you for this and the accessible language. Someone just wrote, and literally just this, well-fed black bloc, let's go. And my favorite one, and I'm saying this because, this is, I can't, if there is a revolution without this, I don't want this. I don't want a revolution. Someone said no revolution without chips. So I think we need to remind ourselves the revolution needs to have some good chips. And chips as in chips, the way we say not chips as in crisps, how some places say it, and I don't know, it doesn't make sense. So onto the questions. One of the things that have been asked, and I think actually I'll come on to this towards the end, but someone asked, with the current model of restaurants being as a business, how would the speakers envision eating out in a post-capitalist world? How would we try new cuisines, eat when visiting another place, etc.? And let's start with Melek on that one.
I think we can have a co-op style systems it can be implemented in restaurants, in eating as well. When I had a cafe, I only worked with immigrant women in the kitchen. I really couldn't function with anyone else. And what we ended up doing, during our time together in the cafe in the 3 years that we were doing that, is we would have, the menu would change according to whatever the women wanted to cook. So everyone would want to cook a dish from their region, what they did well, and we would highlight that in the menu and go, this is this person's dish. And in my ideal world, that kind of businesses that are owned by the people that work in the kitchen are because I just think better food is made when people have invested in it and have input in it in a real way. That would be my ideal dream.
Thank you very much, Melek. And Shiri?
Yeah, I mean, we can cook together and learn from each other. I mean, I can think of, the Warehouse Cafe in Birmingham is a workers' co-op run collectively. Bonington Cafe in London. I mean, there are loads of examples. I can say from my experience that, in our groups, in our co-ops, there is a lot of sharing. And I remember conversations of people walking around with, I don't know, an artichoke saying like, what is this? And somebody else would be like, oh, my mum used to cook it this way. Or like a kind of unfamiliar veg or kind of conversations. We have, I'm on the chats with some of our co-ops and people post in languages that I don't know, sort of examples of what they cooked today from the same ingredients. So, people put videos and so on. Somebody in one of our groups started a YouTube channel of her own cooking. So, this is how we can share these ideas. But also, if we occupy spaces and we have them and they are, they're owned by the community and run by the community, we cook whatever we want, not whatever Pizza Express want us to eat.
Thank you very much. And Amardeep?
Yeah, I mean, on a slightly more like pessimistic note, I guess. I agree with what Melek and Shiri were saying completely as well, by the way. But one thing that stood out to me there was like, how we try the foods when we go to other places and stuff. And so earlier this year, a report came out called the Dasgupta report, which was looking into insecurities in the ecosystem and how, a lack of biodiversity and the rest of it is going to impact food provision. And it makes like a really strong reformist case for like the economic importance of biodiversity and that kind of thing. And in many senses it's very flawed. It's not very radical. Like I kind of hate it in many ways, but it's an acknowledgement at a government level that like actually like food provision on a global level is really, really going to be massively impacted by climate change in particular. So when we think about what does it mean, how are we going to try food when we go to other places, like I do think it's unfortunately important to bear in mind, maybe after this pandemic crisis is over, maybe then think about it for your mental health, not now. But the climate crisis and the climate breakdown is going to mean that we're not really going to be traveling to other places unless we're minted, in which case we're responsible for the rest of us not being able to travel to other places. Like this, at the moment, this conversation seems quite speculative and really exciting and interesting because of that. But actually, like it is really essential, and it's a lot. The current moment that we think about, like what will it be like to go to other places and try food? Because actually functionally, like the problems we should be thinking about are just kind of much more like essential than that, about like, will there be food? Sorry, I also agree with Melek and Shiri.
Thank you very much, Amardeep. So someone said, does anyone know much about Slunglow, the theatre company who turned their venues, the Holbeck, into a food bank? Do you think there could be a more useful connection made between arts venues and food? And also someone else asked, which I think is related, can you say something about street markets? The reason why I think they're related is I think this is, starting to think about like how I suppose like, public places and arts and culture can also relate to food and food provision, but also how we, a culture of food. I'm going to start with Shiri with this one.
Thanks. Okay, put me on the spot. I used to be, in my previous life, I used to be a culture worker at some point. So those spaces were my spaces, sort of not so much theatres, but museums and galleries and sort of exhibition spaces. And I hope not many people from the art world are listening, but the reason that I left those places is because I thought that I wanted to be more socially useful with my time. And that maybe the time for representation is over, and now it's time for action. So, while art is important and useful, and we need it, and we need roses and alongside bread, for sure, open the theatres and the galleries and the, I don't know, music halls or whatever, to the community that they sit within. Those spaces are there. A lot of them stand empty, like for some part of the year or some part of the month. But alongside them, there are the other spaces that maybe are more, we're kind of more used to think about them as community spaces, like the community centers or the churches or the mosques or the libraries that have been defunded, or maybe they lost some of their congregation and they also stand empty. Let's make them useful. In terms of street markets, I mean, there is a synergy obviously between like different like types of food and different infrastructures. We rely quite heavily on, the kind of the food markets, the kind of wholesale food markets, because that's where we get stuff. It's about maintaining those relationships. They're not going to disappear.
Thank you very much for that, Shiri. Gargi, actually, can I come to you on this one as well?
No, absolutely. I was putting some stuff in the chat about some of these things that, and I mean, it's more than we can really talk about here, and I hope that we'll come back to it in some other session as well. We're going through a phase where post-pandemic, in many city centres, there's suddenly much more empty space. The corporate building revolution, which actually was pushing ordinary people out of residential space, is kind of on an uncertain pause, and it's not clear whether those kinds of buildings, some of them won't be finished, some of them won't ever be sold. Certainly there's a kind of question mark whether commercial property spaces will be as lucrative as they have been in recent times. So it's a kind of uncertain moment when like there's spaces that could be taken up and not much happening. Equally, as Shiri has already said, there's been, even before the pandemic, there's a kind of crisis around cultural spaces. And I also want to support cultural spaces, but if you're saying to me the covered market is going where lots of low-income families eat, or the theatre is going, I'm afraid in my, we're all going to die in the end. In my limited time on the planet, I'd try and save the covered market before I save the theatre. I wish I could save both, but that there's some kind of issues about how we prioritise those things. But there's also perhaps something in the ways that different people have been talking about, whether bringing together a range of activities as community spaces, especially if it was about reclaiming some public space, whether that's also part of building an infrastructure for us temporarily while no one knows who owns the space. And I wonder if some of that, again, you see little bits, and a theatre company opening their space, that's also a kind of tiny nudge towards that, isn't it? Because it changes them. They might start with charity, but then they're suddenly mobilising, organising with different people, and something different happens. And I guess I'm so excited to hear that Corktown is getting a warehouse, because I'm really so interested in that. What with our resources do we have to put in place so we can't get knocked sideways? Like it's like buying a lorry or getting a warehouse. They're all kind of those kinds of things, aren't they? Once you've got that, it kind of doesn't matter who drives the lorry or who unlocks the warehouse. It's because they're kind of things that extend the reach of what our work together can do. And I think thinking about how to use public space is also part of that, like how you learn to not just be a blip, but to find ways to kind of just root in a bit more, so you're harder to kick aside. But we talk about that every time we meet.
Thank you very much, Gargi. Melek?
I mean, it's all very speculative, isn't it? I would hope, I mean, these empty spaces would mean, that there's ways that we can, communities can reclaim them and do exciting new things, that this is an opportunity to, during this lockdown and all the, community spirit that's come out of it means that there's new ways we use these spaces. But there's also a worry that, opportunistic investors come and, take these spaces that are empty and probably cheaper because they need to be filled. And the panic of that means it's taken over by large corporations. So I would hope that that doesn't happen, but I think that both might happen, and I'm excited about what I could do in the local community. I love markets, but I feel like that again they're being hijacked by quite middle class ideas of what a market is. And I've been involved in projects with Ridley Road Market and how to protect Ridley Road Market in becoming like a gentrified space. And there's been some amazing projects happening. One with a great organization I was working with, where they set up in Ridley Road Market, they built a stall where if you want to use the market, what you had to do is you had to buy things from the local market, bring it to the space, and to get, basically it was like a pop-up restaurant, but to be able to eat in the restaurant you had to buy food from the market and bring it to the chef, who would make a meal with it that evening, and that's how you claimed your space in the restaurant. So there's like really cool things like that happen. I'm hopeful that more creative things like that will happen.
And Amardeep?
Yeah, I mean, really interesting stuff that's already been said. I mean, I guess, yeah, I'm also less interested necessarily in bringing like opera to the opera than I am in like democratizing the arts and culture sector more broadly, and like, you know, the cooperative, like what we call the new economy, which is, you know, the cooperative economy, I think has some potential in terms of reinvigorating high streets. There's a lot of work being done trying to enable communities to buy up pubs or to get leases on spaces on the high street and to run them as community ventures. And I think in that sense, you know, there is a real space to also bring, you know, to make culture more accessible at the same time as pairing that with like material provision. And I think that could be really, really exciting too. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Amardeep. So, I mean, honestly, time flies when you're having fun. We have actually gone over the time we intended to keep all of you here. So thank you very much for everyone who joined us and listened to us tonight. And I just wanted, as a final reminder, if you want to keep up with the work that our speakers are doing, please just search their names on social media. They are all on social media. And if you want to keep up with the work of Cooperation Town, it's cooperation.town, their website, and all the information is there. And actually some specific questions for Co-op Town were posted in the chat, but unfortunately we're out of time. But I'm sure there's contact details on the website, and you can either contact them on social media or send them an email, and they will get back to you. So thank you very much for tuning into this event. Please visit leftbookclub.com if you want to become a member, and follow us at Left Book Club on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. And don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel while you're here. Our next events, we have some very incredible events coming up. On the 29th of April at 7 p.m. UK time, we have an event discussing the book Manning Marable, How Capitalism Underdeveloped Black America, with HLT Kwan, Paul Heidemann, and Avia Saraday. And on the 6th of May, we have a event on Rosa Luxemburg, Socialism or Barbarism, with Peter Huddis, Eric Blanc, Joanna Busama, and Dilar Dirick. And on the 13th of May, the next event in this series is Anticapitalism and Work, and that's with Gargi Bhattacharyya, that's with Vijay Prashad, Dalia Gabriel, and Amelia Horgan. All of these will be on our social media, so if you follow us on Instagram and Twitter, you will certainly be able to keep up to date with the registration links. And of course, we're looking forward to having you at those events. Thank you very much, and have a good night.